Chapter 29 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. It was a hard summer for Martin. Manuscript readers and editors were away on vacation, and publications that ordinarily returned a decision in 3 weeks now retained his manuscript for 3 months or more. The consolation he drew from it was that a saving in postage was effected by the deadlock. Only the robber publications seemed to remain actively in business, and to them Martin disposed of all his early efforts, such as pearl diving, the sea as a career, turtle catching, and the Northeast trades. For these manuscripts he never received a penny. It is true, after 6 months' correspondence, he effected a compromise, whereby he received a safety razor for turtle catching, and that the Acropolis, having agreed to give him $5 cash and $5 yearly subscriptions for the Northeast trades, fulfilled the second part of the agreement. For a sonnet on Stevenson, he managed to wring $2 out of a Boston editor who was running a magazine with a Matthew Arnold taste and a penny dreadful purse. The Peri and the Pearl, a clever skit of a poem of 200 lines, just finished, white-hot from his brain, won the heart of the editor of a San Francisco magazine, published in the interest of a great railroad. When the editor wrote, offering him payment in transportation, Martin wrote back to inquire if the transportation was transferable. It was not, and so, being prevented from peddling it, he asked for the return of the poem. Back it came, with the editor's regrets, and Martin sent it to San Francisco again, this time to the Hornet, a pretentious monthly that had been fanned into a constellation of the first magnitude by the brilliant journalist who founded it. But the Hornet's light had begun to dim long before Martin was born. The editor promised Martin $15 for the poem, but, when it was published, seemed to forget about it. Several of his letters being ignored, Martin indited an angry one which drew a reply. It was written by a new editor, who coolly informed Martin that he declined to be held responsible for the old editor's mistakes, and that he did not think much of the Peri and the Pearl anyway. But the Globe, a Chicago magazine, gave Martin the most cruel treatment of all. He had refrained from offering his sea lyrics for publication until driven to it by starvation. After having been rejected by a dozen magazines, they had come to rest in the Globe office. There were 30 poems in the collection, and he was to receive $1 apiece for them. The first month 4 were published, and he promptly received a check for $4. But when he looked over the magazine, he was appalled at the slaughter. In some cases the titles had been altered. Finis, for instance, being changed to the Finish, and the Song of the Outer Reef to the Song of the Coral Reef. In one case, an absolutely different title, a misappropriate title, was substituted. In place of his own, Medusa Lights, the editor had printed The Backward Track. The slaughter in the body of the poems was terrifying. Martin groaned and sweated and thrust his hands through his hair. Phrases, lines, and stanzas were cut out, interchanged, or juggled about in the most incomprehensible manner. Sometimes lines and stanzas not his own were substituted for his. He could not believe that a sane editor could be guilty of such maltreatment, and his favorite hypothesis was that his poems must have been doctored by the office boy or the stenographer. Martin wrote immediately, begging the editor to cease publishing the lyrics and to return them to him. He wrote again and again, begging, entreating, threatening, but his letters were ignored. Month by month the slaughter went on, till the 30 poems were published, and month by month he received a check for those which had appeared in the current number. Despite these various misadventures, the memory of the White Mouse $40 check sustained him, though he was driven more and more to hack work. He discovered a bread-and-butter field in the agricultural weeklies and trade journals. Though among the religious weeklies he found he could easily starve. At his lowest ebb, when his black suit was in pawn, he made a 10 strike, or so it seemed to him, in a prize contest arranged by the county committee of the Republican Party. There were 3 branches of the contest, and he entered them all, laughing at himself bitterly the while, in that he was driven to such straits to live. His poem won the first prize of $10, his campaign song the second prize of $5, his essay on the principles of the Republican Party the first prize of $25, which was very gratifying to him until he tried to collect. Something had gone wrong in the county committee, and, though a rich banker and a state senator were members of it, the money was not forthcoming. While this affair was hanging fire, he proved that he understood the principles of the Democratic Party by winning the first prize for his essay in a similar contest. And, moreover, he received the money, $25. But the $40 won in the first contest he never received. Driven to shifts in order to see Ruth, and deciding that the long walk from North Oakland to her house and back again consumed too much time, he kept his black suit in pawn in place of his bicycle. The latter gave him exercise, saved him hours of time for work, and enabled him to see Ruth just the same. A pair of knee-duck trousers and an old sweater made him a presentable wheel costume, so that he could go with Ruth on afternoon rides. Besides, he no longer had opportunity to see much of her in her own home, where Mrs. Morse was thoroughly prosecuting her campaign of entertainment. The exalted beings he met there, and to whom he had looked up but a short time before, now bored him. They were no longer exalted. He was nervous and irritable, what of his hard times, disappointments, and close application to work, and the conversation of such people was maddening. He was not unduly egotistic. He measured the narrowness of their minds by the minds of the thinkers in the books he read. At Ruth's home he never met a large mind, with the exception of Professor Caldwell, and Caldwell he had met there only once. As for the rest, they were numbskulls, ninnies, superficial, dogmatic, and ignorant. It was their ignorance that astounded him. What was the matter with them? What had they done with their educations? They had had access to the same books he had. How did it happen that they had drawn nothing from them? He knew that the great minds, the deep and rational thinkers, existed. He had his proofs from the books that had educated him beyond the Morse standard. And he knew that higher intellects than those of the Morse circle were to be found in the world. He read English society novels, wherein he caught glimpses of men and women talking politics and philosophy. And he read of salons in great cities, even in the United States, where art and intellect congregated. Foolishly, in the past, he had conceived that all well-groomed persons above the working class were persons with power of intellect and vigor of beauty. Culture and collars had gone together to him, and he had been deceived into believing that college educations and mastery were the same things. Well, he would fight his way on and up higher. And he would take Ruth with him. Her he dearly loved, and he was confident that she would shine anywhere. As it was clear to him that he had been handicapped by his early environment, so now he perceived that she was similarly handicapped. She had not had a chance to expand. The books on her father's shelves, the paintings on the walls, the music on the piano, all was just so much meretricious display. To real literature, real painting, real music, the Morses and their kind were dead. And bigger than such things was life, of which they were densely, hopelessly ignorant. In spite of their Unitarian proclivities and their masks of conservative broad-mindedness, they were 2 generations behind interpretive science. Their mental processes were medieval, while their thinking on the ultimate data of existence and of the universe struck him as the same metaphysical method that was as young as the youngest race, as old as the caveman, and older. The same that moved the first Pleistocene ape-man to fear the dark, that moved the first hasty Hebrew savage to incarnate Eve from Adam's rib, that moved Descartes to build an idealistic system of the universe out of the projections of his own puny ego, and that moved the famous British ecclesiastic to denounce evolution in satire so scathing as to win immediate applause and leave his name a notorious scrawl on the page of history. So Martin thought, and he thought further, till it dawned upon him that the difference between these lawyers, officers, businessmen, and bank cashiers he had met, and the members of the working class he had known, was on a par with the difference in the food they ate, clothes they wore, neighborhoods in which they lived. Certainly, in all of them was lacking the something more which he found in himself and in the books. The Morses had shown him the best their social position could produce, and he was not impressed by it. A pauper himself, a slave to the money-lender, he knew himself the superior of those he met at the Morses, and, when his one decent suit of clothes was out of pawn, he moved among them a lord of life, quivering with a sense of outrage akin to what a prince would suffer if condemned to live with goat-herds. "You hate and fear the socialists," he remarked to Mr. Morse one evening at dinner. "But why? You know neither them nor their doctrines." The conversation had been swung in that direction by Mrs. Morse, who had been invidiously singing the praises of Mr. Hapgood. The cashier was Martin's black beast, and his temper was a trifle short where the talker of platitudes was concerned. "Yes," he had said, "Charlie Hapgood is what they call a rising young man. Somebody told me as much. And it is true. He'll make the governor's chair before he dies, and who knows, maybe the United States Senate." "What makes you think so?" Mrs. Morse had inquired. "I've heard him make a campaign speech. It was so cleverly stupid and unoriginal, and yet so convincing, that the leaders cannot help but regard him as safe and sure, while his platitudes are so much like the platitudes of the average voter that, oh well, you know you flatter any man by dressing up his own thoughts for him and presenting them to him." "I actually think you are jealous of Mr. Hapgood," Ruth chimed in. "Heaven forbid!" The look of horror on Martin's face stirred Mrs. Morse to belligerence. "You surely don't mean to say that Mr. Hapgood is stupid?" she demanded icily. "No more than the average Republican," was the retort, "or average Democrat either. They are all stupid when they are not crafty, and very few of them are crafty. The only wise Republicans are the millionaires and their conscious henchmen. They know which side their bread is buttered on, and they know why." "I am a Republican," Mr. Morse put in lightly. "Pray, how do you classify me?" "Oh, you are an unconscious henchman." "Henchman?" "Why, yes, you do corporation work. You have no working class nor criminal practice. You don't depend upon wife-beaters and pickpockets for your income. You get your livelihood from the masters of society, and whoever feeds a man is that man's master. Yes, you are a henchman. You are interested in advancing the interests of the aggregations of capital you serve." Mr. Morse's face was a trifle red. "I confess, sir," he said, "that you talk like a scoundrelly socialist." Then it was Martin made his remark. "You hate and fear the socialists, but why? You know neither them nor their doctrines." "Your doctrine certainly sounds like socialism," Mr. Morse replied, while Ruth gazed anxiously from one to the other, and Mrs. Morse beamed happily at the opportunity afforded of rousing her liege lord's antagonism. "Because I say Republicans are stupid, and hold that liberty, equality, and fraternity are exploded bubbles, does not make me a socialist," Martin said with a smile. "Because I question Jefferson and the unscientific Frenchman who informed his mind, does not make me a socialist. Believe me, Mr. Morse, you are far nearer socialism than I, who am its avowed enemy." "Now you please to be facetious," was all the other could say. "Not at all. I speak in all seriousness. You still believe in equality, and yet you do the work of the corporations, and the corporations from day to day are busily engaged in burying equality. And you call me a socialist because I deny equality, because I affirm just what you live up to. The Republicans are foes to equality, though most of them fight the battle against equality with the very word itself, the slogan on their lips. In the name of equality, they destroy equality. That was why I called them stupid. As for myself, I am an individualist. I believe the race is to the swift, the battle to the strong. Such is the lesson I have learned from biology, or at least I think I have learned. As I said, I am an individualist, and individualism is the hereditary and eternal foe of socialism. But you frequent socialist meetings, Mr. Morse challenged. Certainly, just as spies frequent hostile camps. How else are you to learn about the enemy? Besides, I enjoy myself at their meetings. They are good fighters, and, right or wrong, they have read the books. Any one of them knows far more about sociology and all the other ologies than the average captain of industry. Yes, I have been to half a dozen of their meetings, and that doesn't make me a socialist any more than hearing Charlie Hapgood orate made me a Republican. I can't help it, Mr. Morse said feebly, but I still believe you incline that way. Bless me, Martin thought to himself. He doesn't know what I was talking about. He hasn't understood a word of it. What did he do with his education, anyway? Thus, in his development, Martin found himself face to face with economic morality, or the morality of his class, and soon it became to him a grisly monster. Personally, he was an intellectual moralist, and more offending to him than platitudinous pomposity was the morality of those about him, which was a curious hodgepodge of the economic, the metaphysical, the sentimental, and the imitative. A sample of this curious messy mixture he encountered nearer home. His sister Marian had been keeping company with an industrious young mechanic of German extraction, who, after thoroughly learning the trade, had set up for himself in a bicycle repair shop. Also, having got the agency for a low-grade make of wheel, he was prosperous. Marian had called on Martin in his room a short time before to announce her engagement, during which visit she had playfully inspected Martin's palm and told his fortune. On her next visit she brought Hermann von Schmidt along with her. Martin did the honors and congratulated both of them, in language so easy and graceful as to affect disagreeably the peasant mind of his sister's lover. This bad impression was further heightened by Martin's reading aloud the half-dozen stanzas of verse with which he had commemorated Marian's previous visit. It was a bit of society verse, airy and delicate, which he had named The Palmist. He was surprised, when he finished reading it, to note no enjoyment in his sister's face. Instead, her eyes were fixed anxiously upon her betrothed, and Martin, following her gaze, saw spread on that worthy's asymmetrical features nothing but black and sullen disapproval. The incident passed over, they made an early departure, and Martin forgot all about it, though for the moment he had been puzzled that any woman, even of the working class, should not have been flattered and delighted by having poetry written about her. Several evenings later, Marian again visited him, this time alone. Nor did she waste time in coming to the point, upbraiding him sorrowfully for what he had done. "Why, Marian," he chided, "you talk as though you were ashamed of your relatives, or of your brother at any rate." "And I am, too," she blurted out. Martin was bewildered by the tears of mortification he saw in her eyes. The mood, whatever it was genuine. "But, Marian, why should your Hermann be jealous of my writing poetry about my own sister?" "He ain't jealous," she sobbed. "He says it was indecent, obscene." Martin emitted a long, low whistle of incredulity, then proceeded to resurrect and read a carbon copy of The Palmist. "I can't see it," he said finally, proffering the manuscript to her. "Read it yourself and show me whatever strikes you as obscene. That was the word, wasn't it?" "He says so, and he ought to know," was the answer, with a wave aside of the manuscript, accompanied by a look of loathing. "And he says you've got to tear it up. He says he won't have no wife of his with such things written about her which anybody can read. He says it's a disgrace, and he won't stand for it." "Now look here, Marian, this is nothing but nonsense," Martin began, then abruptly changed his mind. He saw before him an unhappy girl, knew the futility of attempting to convince her husband or her, and, though the whole situation was absurd and preposterous, he resolved to surrender. "All right," he announced, tearing the manuscript into half a dozen pieces and throwing it into the waste-basket. He contented himself with the knowledge that even then the original typewritten manuscript was reposing in the office of a New York magazine. Marian and her husband would never know, and neither himself nor they nor the world would lose if the pretty, harmless poem ever were published. Martin, starting to reach into the wastebasket, refrained. "Can I?" she pleaded. He nodded his head, regarding her thoughtfully as she gathered the torn pieces of manuscript and tucked them into the pocket of her jacket. Ocular evidence of the success of her mission. She reminded him of Lizzie Connolly, though there was less of fire and gorgeous flaunting life in her than in that other girl of the working class whom he had seen twice. But they were on a par, the pair of them, in dress and carriage, and he smiled with inward amusement at the caprice of his fancy, which suggested the appearance of either of them in Mrs. Morse's drawing-room. The amusement faded, and he was aware of a great loneliness. This sister of his and the Morse drawing-room were milestones of the road he had traveled, and he had left them behind. He glanced affectionately about him at his few books. They were all the comrades left to him. "Hello? What's that?" he demanded in startled surprise. Marian repeated her question. "Why don't I go to work?" He broke into a laugh that was only half-hearted. "That Herman of yours has been talking to you." She shook her head. "Don't lie," he commanded, and the nod of her head affirmed his charge. "Well, you tell that Herman of yours to mind his own business, that when I write poetry about a girl he's keeping company with, it's his business, but that outside of that he's got no say. Understand? So you don't think I'll succeed as a writer, eh?" he went on. "You think I'm no good, that I've fallen down and am a disgrace to the family." "I think it would be much better if you got a job," she said firmly, and he saw she was sincere. "Herman says—" "Damn Herman," he broke out good-naturedly. "What I want to know is when you're going to get married. Also, you find out from your Herman if he will deign to permit you to accept a wedding present from me." He mused over the incident after she had gone, and once or twice broke out into laughter that was bitter as he saw his sister and her betrothed, all the members of his own class and the members of Ruth's class, directing their narrow little lives by narrow little formulas, herd creatures, flocking together and patterning their lives by one another's opinions, failing of being individuals and of really living life because of the childlike formulas by which they were enslaved. He summoned them before him in apparitional procession. Bernard Higginbotham arm in arm with Mr. Butler, Herman von Schmidt cheek by jowl with Charlie Hapgood, and one by one and in pairs he judged them and dismissed them. Judged them by the standards of intellect and morality he had learned from the books. Vainly he asked, "Where are the great souls, the great men and women?" He found them not among the careless, gross, and stupid intelligences that answered the call of vision to his narrow room. He felt a loathing for them such as Circe must have felt for her swine. When he had dismissed the last one and thought himself alone, a late comer entered, unexpected and unsummoned. Martin watched him and saw the stiff rim, the square cut, double-breasted coat, and the swaggering shoulders of the youthful hoodlum who had once been he. "You were like all the rest, young fellow," Martin sneered. "Your morality and your knowledge were just the same as theirs. You did not think and act for yourself. Your opinions, like your clothes, were ready-made. Your acts were shaped by popular approval. You were cock of your gang because others acclaimed you the real thing. You fought and ruled the gang, not because you liked to. You know you really despised it, but because the other fellows patted you on the shoulder. You licked Cheeseface because you wouldn't give in, and you wouldn't give in partly because you were abysmal brute, and for the rest you believed what everyone about you believed, that the measure of manhood was the carnivorous ferocity displayed in injuring and marring fellow creatures' anatomies. Why, you whelp, you even won other fellows' girls away from them, not because you wanted the girls, but because in the marrow of those about you, those who set your moral pace, was the instinct of the wild stallion and the bull seal. Well, the years have passed, and what do you think about it now? As if in reply, the vision underwent a swift metamorphosis. The stiff rim and the square cut vanished, being replaced by milder garments. The toughness went out of his face, the hardness out of his eyes, and the face, chastened and refined, was irradiated from an inner life of communion with beauty and knowledge. The apparition was very like his present self, and, as he regarded it, he noted the student lamp by which it was illuminated, and the book over which it pored. He glanced at the title and read, "The Science of Aesthetics." Next, he entered the apparition, trimmed the student lamp, and himself went on reading The Science of Aesthetics. End of chapter 29.